I miss handheld gaming. So you might be thinking what I mean by that, since we have the Nintendo Switch and Switch 2, we have the Xbox ROG Ally, we have the Steam Deck. These are all systems you can bring on the go, and actually can play a lot of games that are on home consoles. So why exactly would someone prefer this over this? In most ways, these are objectively better systems. The Switch 2 is infinitely more powerful than any true handheld Nintendo's ever made, and it also gives you the ability to play on the TV even though you don't have to. However, that's not everything. The first thing is just portability. Most people are not going to be able to fit a Switch 2 or a Steam Deck in their pocket, or at the very least if they can, it's going to weigh them down. Take like a Game Boy Advance SP, a DS, or a 3DS. That's going to fit in most pockets and just be much easier to carry around. But that's not really the main reason I miss handheld gaming. What I mean by that is handheld gaming just feeling different than games you'd play on the TV. Don't get me wrong, I think it's awesome that we can play console quality games on the go, but there was always something about having that different system, having different games on portable systems compared to consoles. And I'm clearly not alone in thinking this way, because there's so many products that try to replicate this, like the AYN Thor. While those are great, those are extremely expensive now and not very accessible. This is also the reason why we've seen 3DSs skyrocket in price recently. Over the past 2 to 3 years, 3DSs have went up exponentially, with some models going for over $400. And the reason is because people love handheld gaming. They love the true handheld experience of playing a 3DS game, a DS game, a Game Boy Advance game. Same goes for Sony's portables with the Vita and the PSP. You weren't playing these to get the same experience you would get on a modern home console. You were using these to play something different. And I think this all started when mobile games began to become mainstream. Before the iPhone and the App Store, pretty much the only way to play games on the go was with a portable system. Like, yeah, you had a few games on flip phones, but those were typically very tiny time waster games. Most people who wanted to play games on the go still had to bring around their Game Boy Advance or their DS or their PSP. But then once we started to get more mobile games that were more in-depth, a lot of people just stopped bringing their consoles with them because they could bring their iPod Touch or their iPhone or whatever it may be, and it was clear that handheld consoles were losing ground. The PS Vita was a complete flop, and while the 3DS eventually sold well, it was far from the heights of the DS. So then when the Nintendo Switch launched in 2017, it was pretty much the end of true handheld gaming as we know it. All Nintendo's games would be on one system going forward, which you could play on the go or at home. And because of that, these are mostly home console feeling games. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think the Nintendo Switch is arguably the greatest Nintendo console of all time. And I'm not saying I want to go back to having a dedicated handheld and a dedicated home console, because I think that just leads to bigger and better libraries on the Nintendo Switch and Switch 2. Plus that would kind of compete directly with the Switch 2 being a console that can go on the go. But it doesn't mean I don't miss that, and it doesn't mean I can't use some of my older consoles. For example, I have a couple 3DS systems, and one of them can play any Nintendo DS or 3DS game ever made, and especially recently I've been playing a lot of games on it. I'm still using my Switch 2, but there's been a few times where I was out, and instead of having to carry around my Switch 2 case, I just put my 3DS in my pocket and had an almost unlimited amount of games. And also with handheld gaming, a lot of these games were built to play in small bursts. Like, it's just easy to pick up these games, play them for a few minutes, and then put it away. And not to say that you can't do that on the Switch or Switch 2, but I feel like when we think of home console and handheld console games, there's just been different definitions. Where you think of the home console game as just the bigger, more grander experience, and you think of the handheld game as a smaller one. And while that's never 100% been true, it definitely does hold some weight. And also, being honest, I think a lot of it is nostalgia. If you're someone who grew up with a Nintendo Switch and never had a 3DS, there's a good chance that you probably think that what I'm talking about just makes no sense. Like, why would you want objectively less powerful systems with less features? And yeah, a lot of it is nostalgia for people like myself who grew up in the DS era and 3DS era, and now seeing just a completely different landscape. There's also a lot of things about the system to love that aren't even around anymore or are barely used. For example, DS had PictoChat, and there's no reason outside of novelty to use that today, but it really used to be a fun, novel thing to use. And also, I think it's interesting to look back at the DS, because this was Nintendo's last system before smartphones took over. Like, you had quote-unquote games for this that were literally just collections of books because there weren't really e-readers yet, or at least they weren't mainstream. You also had an internet browser that you could put into the DS as a physical cartridge. Again, there's no reason to actually use any of this today, but I just think it's really fun to look back on. And then when the 3DS came out, it was already after smartphones, as mobile games were really starting to pick up around the early 2010s. But there's still a lot of features that were really cool here. There's the AR card stuff, there was Face Raiders, there was of course Street Pass Me Plaza and Street Pass as a whole, which encourage you to bring your 3DS around and walk past other people with 3DSs. I don't always like to use the term you had to be there when talking about games or trying to prop up a game, but for Street Pass, I really think you had to. So yeah, Street Pass does still exist. If you have your 3DS in rest mode and walk past someone else with their 3DS in rest mode, you will get a Street Pass, but it's 2026, and the 3DS hasn't been Nintendo's main console for 9 years now. So maybe if you go to a convention or you go to the Nintendo store, you'll find a few Street Passes, but I highly doubt any kids going to school, bringing their 3DS are going to get any street passes, or even walking in public or going to a restaurant, chances are you're not going to get any. However, when I was a kid in middle school and I had my 3DS, I would always get street passes when I went out in public, whether it was in school, whether I was at a restaurant, wherever I was, I seemingly always got street passes. And it was just a cool system that had so many games working in it, that had Street Pass Me Plaza just be a collection of awesome games. And it's things like that that I miss about this era, because the Nintendo Switch, while portable, feels more like a home console. You're getting more home console experience games. There's less personalization, there's less gimmicky things like that, and while the Nintendo Switch and Switch 2 are objectively better systems in most ways, I do think they're missing a lot of that charm. So I don't want Nintendo to come out and say, we're making a 4DS to go along with the Switch 2, because I think that's pointless. I think the Switch 2 is a great console, and I don't think Nintendo needs to change anything now. However, what I do want to see is more people just finding ways to play handheld games, whether it's by modding their 3DS or PSP or whatever it might be, whether it's more companies making things like the AYM Thor, whether it's more developers making games that feel like true handheld games. I just don't want the legacy of handheld games to be forgotten. And being honest, for a long time, I wasn't really playing handheld games for a while. I only recently got back into my 3DS. I just remembered how many great games there are and how easy it is to just carry around. Even the new 3DS XL, it'll fit easily in any pocket. And also something I loved was just the different designs of these consoles. Like the 3DS and 2DS just had so many different designs. Like so many of these were just so cool. And obviously they don't add anything to the system itself, but with the Switch, there hasn't really been many. Like, yeah, you have different Joy-Cons. There's a couple special editions, I think. Like, the Switch Lite has different colors, but it really hasn't felt the same. So if you're someone who maybe grew up after the 3DS, because at this point there are teenagers who really don't remember much of the 3DS era, you can still buy a 2DS for relatively cheap. Like, you can still find them for around $100 or less. The 2DS is honestly probably the least portable of the 3DS systems because you can't fold it. But even if you could find an original 3DS or a 3DS XL for under $200, there's so much you can do on it, especially if you mod it. And if you're someone who's questioning what I'm talking about because you weren't around during this time, I think a lot of this is still going to be nostalgia based, so you might not have the same feelings of it. But I truly think there is still a lot of reasons to go back to a true handheld console. And if you're someone like me who really didn't play on your 3DS or your DS or your Game Boy Advance for so long, go back them and give them another try, because there's still a lot of games on here that you can't play on modern systems. Plus, if you're going somewhere where you know that you might want to play a game and you don't want to bring around your Switch, these systems are just a lot easier to bring around and have a lot more games you can just play in short bursts. So anyway, that's just my thoughts on this topic. Again, I love the Nintendo Switch 2 and the Nintendo Switch. I don't think Nintendo should go back to making a truly dedicated handheld system, but it doesn't mean that I don't miss handheld gaming. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on this. And if you like this video, be sure to subscribe because I make a lot of other videos like it. And I'll see you next time.